Welcome to today's conference, Community Project Funding Program webinar series. Please note that all audio connections are muted to reduce background noise. You may submit a question via the chat, and your question will be answered at the end of the call. If you need technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. And with that, I'll hand the call over to Benjamin Sturm from the Cloudburst Group. Please go ahead.
Welcome and thank you all for joining the third session of our three-part webinar series on the environmental review requirements for the Community Project Funding Program. Today we'll be discussing the cost eligibility and documenting the environmental review for CPF grants. My name is Ben Sturm and I'm with the Cloudburst Group. Presenting with me today is Omri Gross from HUD's Office of Environment and Energy, as well as Harrison Martin O'Brien, also with the Cloudburst Group. Next slide. Throughout today's session, we'll be discussing the details of the cost eligibility, documenting the environmental review, and touching on topics such as mitigation and tiering. And then we'll go through some more frequently asked questions towards the end of the presentation. Next slide. So just a couple additional housekeeping items. This session will be 75 minutes long with time for FAQs at the end of the presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions through the Q&A feature on WebEx. If your questions are not addressed today, we encourage you to submit your questions through the HUD Exchange Ask a Question help desk for the CPF program. Next slide. And just some additional instructions on how to submit an AAQ. The AAQ portal is on HUD Exchange. You could find this by going to hudexchange.info and looking for the Program Support tab. So when you click on the Ask a Question link, just after you enter your contact information on page 2, under the My Question is Related to drop-down menu, please be sure to select CPF Community Project Funding. It'll also be helpful to provide your CPF grant number. I do believe there is a drop-down feature specifically for you to provide that grant number now. If you do not see it, just please provide it in the subject line or the question description. Okay, next slide. All right, I'd like to now turn this over to Omri Gross to talk about cost eligibility.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is Omri Gross, and I'm the Program Environmental Clearance Officer for HUD CPD programs, including the Community Project Funding Program. Okay, so today we're going to do a deep dive into cost eligibility as it relates to HUD's environmental review requirements for CPF grants. We'll cover soft costs and HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs. And we'll also cover hard costs, how to handle work under existing contracts, and then we'll put it all into perspective with some graphic visualizations that tie it all together. Next slide, please. Okay, so an important note here on eligible costs before we go any further. HUD interprets eligible costs as costs of compliant activities, including environmental compliance. So in order for costs to be eligible for payment, the activities would still need to be ultimately be covered by a satisfactory environmental review showing no unmitigatable environmental harm. This could either be the nationwide environmental review that HUD already completed for certain covered CPF soft costs, or the aggregated project-specific environmental review conducted by the grantee's responsible entity. In most cases, where the grant involves both soft and hard cost activities, the project will often utilize both HUD's Part 50 environmental review for covered CPF soft costs and a project-specific environmental review aggregating all other activities. Planning only grants, though, for instance, would already be covered by HUD's Part 50 and would not need a separate review before proceeding. Now, we will cover this in more detail during this webinar, but a list of covered soft costs that do not require completion of a separate environmental review can also be found in the project description of HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Review for CPF soft costs. You can find links to HUD's Part 50 for soft costs on this slide and on the CPF landing pages. And there's a separate environmental review record, Part 50 environmental review record for soft costs for each fiscal year. So you can see the links there on the slide. And then they're also both available on the CPF landing pages. Now, in general, all other post-nexus soft costs and physical activities need to be covered by a separate satisfactory environmental review prior to incurring and requesting payment. Now, there is one caveat here that must be noted, and that's for any work that was under contractual obligation prior to the federal nexus. And we'll address this in more detail shortly. Next slide, please. Okay, but first, let's dive into soft costs. Now, as mentioned in the last slide, most soft costs, but not all, are covered by HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Review for CPF soft costs. Now, again, you can find links to each review here or on the CPF landing pages. And you can see a list of which soft costs are covered in the project description of those reviews. In general, all planning, administrative, and operating costs are covered. Maintenance activities that comply with HUD's Notice 1602 are also covered by HUD's Part 50 review for soft costs, and we'll talk more about this as well in the coming slides. Now, with the recent legislative changes that were enacted for both fiscal years last December, there is also no longer a cap on how much of your CPF grant can go to soft costs. However, if you intend to repurpose your grant to 100% soft costs only, you must get approval from your grant officer to do so. Now, all soft costs covered by HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Review for soft costs can be incurred any time after the date of legislative enactment for your fiscal year grant without the completion of a separate environmental review. And that's because HUD already completed a nationwide review covering these soft cost activities specifically. Now, the nationwide reviews, for the Part 50 nationwide reviews for CPF soft costs, like I said, there's one for each fiscal year, and their effective dates are separate for each fiscal year. For fiscal year 22, the environmental review for CPF soft costs is good from the effective date is March 15th, 2022. So it covers anything after March 15th, 2022. And then for fiscal year 23, that soft cost review, Part 50 review, covers anything after 12/29/2022. Now, for soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 review, a separate environmental review exempt or CENST, categorically excluded, not subject to determination, must be made by the responsible entity or HUD prior to incurring. And for all soft costs, whether they're covered by HUD's Part 50 review or they're not, and you have to cover them with your own environmental review determination, you can only start requesting payment after the grant agreement has been executed. So again, regardless of whether your soft costs are covered by HUD's Part 50 or if you need to do another environmental review determination to cover those soft costs, for all soft costs, you can only start requesting payment after the grant agreement has been executed. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a quick breakdown of the types of soft cost activities that are and are not covered by HUD's Part 50 review for CPF soft costs, with their corresponding regulatory citations under Part 58. So covered soft costs include environmental and other studies, resource identification, development of plans and strategies, so essentially planning, information and financial advisory services, administrative and management expenses, inspections, testing of properties for hazards or defects, engineering or design costs, technical assistance and training, operating costs, including most maintenance activities, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the slides to come, and purchase of vehicles, but not other equipment. So again, that's a list of the soft costs that are covered by the Part 50 Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs that HUD has already completed. Now, some soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Nationwide Environmental Review for soft costs are activities such as public services, purchase of insurance, purchase of tools, tenant-based rental assistance, various supportive services, economic development activities, affordable housing pre-development costs, and approval of supplemental assistance. So again, you have both columns here. One are the soft costs that are covered by HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs. If your project only includes the soft costs that are covered, then you do not need to do a separate environmental review for those soft costs. If you have any soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs, then you would need to complete a separate environmental review determination for those non-covered soft costs. Okay, now if you have any additional questions about whether your soft costs are covered by HUD's review or would require their own environmental review, please reach out and discuss with your environmental officer. Next slide, please. Okay, so this next slide shows the table from HUD's notice on categorizing activities as maintenance for the purposes of environmental review. Again, you can find a link to that maintenance notice on slide 7. And so again, this is a notice that HUD put out that provides guidance on when you can and which activities you can categorize as maintenance versus rehab. So as you can see, the table breaks down, and again, this table can be found at the end of that notice, right? So it's actually in that CPD notice. It's publicly available on HUD Exchange, or you can use the link in these slides, and this table is found at the end of that notice. So as you can see, the table breaks down different types of activities and whether they are considered maintenance or rehab for environmental review purposes. All activities listed under maintenance, except for the ones with an asterisk next to them, are covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review for soft costs, meaning that if that's your soft cost, right, if that activity is one of your soft costs, then it's already covered by HUD's Part 50. You don't need to do a separate environmental review to cover that particular soft cost. Now, again, this applies to anything that's under the maintenance column, except for the activities with an asterisk next to the activity name. Now, these activities can be incurred anytime after the date of enactment for your fiscal year grant and would not need to be covered by a separate project-specific environmental review prior to incurring. Now, the activities marked by an asterisk are not covered by HUD's Part 50 review because they may require the purchase of flood insurance if they occur in a special flood hazard area and if the costs exceed the standard deductible for the specific type of structure or unit under the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, because these activities require further review to determine whether they will require flood insurance, they will need to be covered by a separate environmental review conducted by the responsible entity for the project. So again, HUD's Part 50 for soft costs, for CPF soft costs, covers everything in the maintenance column except for the activities with an asterisk next to them. If the activity has an asterisk next to them, those activities must be covered by a separate environmental review by the grantee's responsible entity, because there needs to be a determination made as to whether or not flood insurance needs to be purchased. So let's run through a few examples here. So for this, these are kind of broken out by, the feature or system, right? So there's like the site activities, building exterior activities, roof activities. So if we're just taking a look at site, right? Lawn care, like litter pickup, mowing, raking, trimming trees and shrubs. Those are all considered maintenance activities, whereas new landscaping throughout an area or construction of new walkways, driveways, or parking areas or replacement thereof would be considered rehab activities. If we look at building exterior, we can see that cleaning and fixing gutters and downspouts are examples of maintenance activities, whereas cleaning masonry or stripping painted surfaces by sandblasting or applying new exterior siding would be considered rehab. For the roof, fixing leaks or application of waterproof coating to a flat roof or replacement of deteriorated flashing. Those are all considered maintenance, examples of maintenance activities, whereas the complete replacement of the roof with new shingles, tiles, roll roofing, membrane, or new metal roof would be considered rehab activities, as well as installation of solar panels. Those would be considered rehab activities as well. For windows and doors, washing windows, caulking, weather stripping, fixing broken window panes, replacing broken door locks. Those are all considered examples of maintenance activities, whereas replacement of windows or replacement of exterior doors or adding new windows or storm doors would be considered rehab. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's the second half of the table from the maintenance notice. So again, this is the same table, it's just additional activities here. You can see a few more maintenance activities here that are marked by an asterisk, such as replacement of stoves and appliances and HVAC systems, repairing damage from broken pipes, etc. Right? So there's a few more fixing plumbing leaks, yeah, replacement of stoves, refrigerators, cabinet hardware, right? All of those things are, though they're technically considered maintenance, there's a question as to there needs to be some further environmental review to determine whether purchase of flood insurance is necessary, right? So anything with an asterisk next to the name under maintenance, that would require its own environmental review determination. It would not be covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review for CPF soft costs. And again, you can find this table in the actual CPD notice, HUD CPD notice, I believe it's 1602, which is HUD CPD notice for categorizing activities as maintenance for the purposes of environmental review. And again, you can find a link to that in these slides, and you can also find that on the HUD Exchange. Next slide, please. Okay, so to summarize the guidance on CPF soft costs, for all soft costs covered by HUD's Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs, you may start incurring those soft costs from the date of enactment for your fiscal year CPF grant because they're covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review for CPF soft costs. So they're already covered by an environmental review that HUD completed for the nation for CPF soft costs. So for all soft costs covered by HUD's Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs, you may start incurring those soft costs from the date of enactment for your fiscal year CPF grant. The project would not need a separate environmental review for those covered soft costs specifically, again, because HUD has already completed that environmental review under Part 50. And the recipient would be able to request payment for these covered soft costs once the grant agreement has been executed. Again, the environmental review has already been completed for those covered soft costs. So all you as the grantee would need to do to be able to request payment for those soft costs is to execute the grant agreement. Now, for any other soft costs not covered by HUD's Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs, recipients must complete an environmental review determination determining that the soft costs are exempt or categorically excluded, not subject to CENST, prior to incurring, but can do so anytime after the date of enactment for their fiscal year CPF grant. So again, for any other soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Nationwide Environmental Review for CPF soft costs, you would have to complete a separate environmental review determination that the soft costs are exempt or categorically excluded, not subject to, prior to incurring those soft costs, but you can do so anytime after the date of enactment for your fiscal year CPF grant. Now, an environmental review determination for non-covered soft costs can be separate, or as we like to refer to it, disaggregated from and conducted prior to completion of the larger aggregated project environmental review. So again, if you have these soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 environmental review for CPF soft costs, you'll have to do a separate environmental review determination for those soft costs, but you can do so separately. You can do so in a way that's separate or disaggregated from the larger aggregated project review. So essentially, you can do these. You can do this separate, disaggregated soft costs environmental review for these non-covered CPF soft costs anytime after the date of enactment, and it can be separate from your larger overall environmental review for the project. Now, this can also be combined with, so you can separate it if you want, but you can also just combine it with the larger environmental review for the project if timing is not an issue for you. But again, this can take a little bit more time, right? Because if you're doing when you're doing the environmental review for the larger project, when you're aggregating all of those other activities, the hard cost activities, the physical activities, everything after the nexus, it can take some time to complete the environmental review process, right? So this is an option to disaggregate those soft costs, right? That again are not covered by HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Environmental Review for soft costs. So this allows you to disaggregate those and complete a separate environmental review determination just for those non-covered soft costs. And again, you can do this separately and prior to the larger environmental review for the project. Now, again, recipients must still execute the grant agreement prior to requesting payment for any soft costs, so that doesn't change. Now, as far as repurposing to 100% soft costs, there are a few situations in which repurposing may be an option, and of course, if, for instance, if the project took choice limiting actions, or let's say, work under contract that was entered into prior to the federal nexus was allowed to proceed, and then there were issues with completing a satisfactory environmental review after that. Then those are situations which we'll talk about a little bit more. Those are situations in which repurposing to 100% soft costs may be in the best interest of the project. And so, as we mentioned before, recent legislative changes have removed the 20% cap on soft costs, but grantees must still work with their grant officer to approve repurposing to 100% soft costs. So even though the soft cost cap was removed, you still have to adhere to the project description that Congress passed essentially for your project. And if your project description includes physical hard cost activities, then you'll need to reach out to your grant officer to discuss repurposing those grant funds to 100% soft cost, if that is what your intention is. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now let's move on to hard cost eligibility and the work under contract caveat. So as you'll recall, under 24 CFR 58.22, there is a prohibition on taking choice limiting actions that we learned about in the previous webinar. And this prohibition on taking choice limiting actions states that following the federal nexus, no party may enter into additional construction contracts or take other new choice limiting commitments or actions including spending funds or performing physical work, until the environmental review process is completed and all necessary approvals are received. Now, the responsible entity is required to complete a satisfactory environmental review covering all activities and work that took place or is proposed to take place following the federal nexus. Once a satisfactory environmental review is complete, the grantee can begin to incur new eligible hard costs. Grantees can only request payment for hard costs after both the environmental review is complete and the grant agreement has been executed. Now, one important caveat here that we touched on in the previous webinars is what we've been referring to as work under contract. So following the federal nexus, grantees are technically allowed to undertake physical work under contractual obligations that were entered into prior to the federal nexus, and can incur those activities anytime after the federal nexus as hard costs that are potentially eligible for repayment. But as we've mentioned many times in the previous webinars, grantees would be doing so at their own risk. And that's because if any of the work that has taken place after the federal nexus causes unmitigatable environmental harm, is prohibited under environmental laws or HUD's environmental regulations, or precludes the completion of federal consultation requirements, those project activities cannot be funded, and you will need to reach out to your grant officer to discuss other options such as repurposing of funds. So again, I'll just repeat that. So following the federal nexus, grantees are technically allowed to undertake physical work associated with contractual obligations that were in place prior to the federal nexus. However, grantees would be doing so at your own risk. And again, that's because if any of the work that has taken place after the federal nexus causes unmitigatable environmental harm, is prohibited under environmental laws or HUD's environmental regulations, or precludes the completion of federal consultation requirements, those project activities cannot be funded, and you will need to reach out to your grant officer to discuss other options such as repurposing of funds. Next slide, please. Okay, now before we get into the graphic visualizations, I just wanted to add a reminder here about what a satisfactory environmental review consists of. A satisfactory environmental review must aggregate all related project activities performed after the federal nexus, except for soft costs covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs, or soft costs that are covered by a separate environmental review determination for non-covered soft costs, right? So as we mentioned before, there's the Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs covers most soft costs, but if your project has some of those additional soft costs that are not covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review, then you have the option of either rolling those non-covered soft costs into your larger environmental review for their larger project, or separating those soft costs out into a separate environmental review determination for those non-covered soft costs. So again, a satisfactory environmental review must aggregate all related project activities performed after the federal nexus, except for the soft costs covered by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review, or the soft costs that are covered by a separate environmental review determination. Now, the federal nexus for each fiscal year is listed on this slide. And a satisfactory environmental review must show that the project will not result in any unmitigatable environmental harm. A satisfactory environmental review must also show that the project was able to complete all necessary consultations, including any after-the-fact consultations, with environmental review authorities for any work performed or to be performed after the federal nexus. And if a satisfactory environmental review cannot be completed for the project for any reason, you will need to reach out to your grant officer to discuss other options such as repurposing of funds. Next slide, please. Okay, now let's bring this all full circle and walk through some graphics to help us visualize cost eligibility and process flow as it relates to environmental review requirements. Now, these cost eligibility charts are logic trees that we put together to assist in quickly and easily determining which project costs are eligible for payment. There are separate charts for fiscal year 22 and fiscal year 23, respectively. And there are also a couple important caveats that apply to both charts, which are listed on the chart itself. First, this chart assumes that eligible costs are for activities covered by the project scope of a satisfactory environmental review, meaning that anytime you're using this chart and reach a determination that costs are eligible for repayment, the corresponding activities must be included in a satisfactory environmental review to be eligible for payment. Remember, this could be HUD's Part 50 review for soft costs, or the project-specific environmental review conducted by the responsible entity under Part 58, or both. If some costs or activities are not covered by the project environmental review or by HUD's Part 50 nationwide review for CPF soft costs, then those activities or costs are not eligible for payment. So again, anytime you're using this chart and reach a determination that costs are eligible for repayment, the corresponding activities must be included in a satisfactory environmental review to be eligible for payment. Now, secondly, costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. So again, if you're going through this chart and you're trying to determine what does it mean when they say incurred before or after a certain date, incurred, costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. And then finally, this chart provides a link to HUD's nationwide Part 50 review for CPF soft costs, which lists all soft costs covered in its project description and indicates a few supporting documentations that might be necessary to make a determination of repayment eligibility. So just walking through here, as you can see, there are two buckets or trees, one for soft costs and one for hard costs. Soft costs are pretty straightforward. For fiscal year 22, any soft costs incurred prior to the date of legislative enactment, which was March 15th, 2022 for fiscal year 2022. So again, any soft costs incurred prior to the date of legislative enactment are not eligible for payment. Full stop. Any soft costs incurred after the date of enactment are eligible, but again, only if they are covered by a satisfactory environmental review. Now again, this could be HUD's Part 50 review for covered soft costs, or a separate environmental review conducted by the responsible entity under Part 58, or both. You could have activities that are covered by HUD's Part 50 for soft costs, and you can have activities that are covered by your responsible entity's environmental review for the project. Now, hard costs is where there's a little bit more nuance. For fiscal year 22, any hard costs incurred prior to the federal nexus, which was between July 18th to July 20th, because it was the date of receipt of the letter of invitation. So again, for fiscal year 22, any hard costs incurred prior to the federal nexus are not eligible for repayment. Full stop. Any hard costs that were incurred after the federal nexus that were also incurred after the environmental review process was completed are eligible for payment, again, if they are covered by and included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project. So again, any hard costs that were incurred after the federal nexus that were also incurred after the environmental review process was completed are eligible for payment if they are covered by and included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project. Now, hard cost activities associated with new contracts or commitments entered into after the federal nexus, but prior to the environmental review completion, are considered choice limiting actions and are not eligible for repayment. Please contact your environmental officer if you believe your project took choice limiting actions, and they will help you with next steps. They'll help you determine if it is a choice limiting action and what next steps and options you have. Now, for hard costs that were incurred after the federal nexus, but before the environmental review process was completed, and are associated with a pre-nexus contractual obligation, so work under contract, those costs and activities would technically be eligible for repayment, but only if they are ultimately covered by and included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project. They are not considered choice limiting actions because they are associated with pre-nexus contractual obligations. And while HUD recommends and encourages that all work stops after the federal nexus as best practice, we cannot require stopping work on activities under contractual obligations that predate the project becoming federalized. That's why you're allowed to continue with that work, because HUD can't require stopping work on activities under contractual obligations that predate the project becoming federalized. Now, just remember that moving forward with these types of activities prior to completion of the environmental review process, these type of work under contract activities, may put the project at risk of not being able to be funded if a satisfactory environmental review cannot ultimately be completed. Next slide, please. Okay, so staying on fiscal year 22, this second graphic shows the updated and current process flow, which is now in effect for fiscal year 22. Under the updated and current fiscal year 22 process, you are now allowed to incur eligible soft costs from the date of enactment, which was March 15th, 2022 for fiscal year 22. And you can see the Nationwide Part 50 for a list of covered soft costs, of course. So, okay, so again, under the updated current fiscal year 22 process, you are now allowed to incur eligible soft costs from the date of enactment, March 15th, 2022. And you are allowed to start incurring ongoing eligible hard costs, so work under contract, at your own risk after the federal nexus if the commitments were in place prior to the federal nexus, and if those activities are ultimately covered by a satisfactory environmental review. Then, after the grant agreement has been executed for a project, you can start requesting repayment of eligible soft costs. And then once the grant agreement and environmental review have been completed, you may undertake all eligible activities and request payment of all remaining eligible project funds. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was fiscal year 22. Now let's take a look at fiscal year 23. This chart, the cost eligibility chart tree, is essentially the same for fiscal year 23, but the dates for legislative enactment and federal nexus are the same, whereas in fiscal year 22, they were different. So again, under fiscal year 23 here, soft costs are pretty straightforward, right? For fiscal year 23, any soft costs incurred prior to the date of legislative enactment, and for fiscal year 23, that's 12/29/2022, so December 29, 2022. Any soft costs incurred prior to the date of legislative enactment are not eligible for payment. Full stop. Any soft costs incurred after the date of enactment are eligible, but only if they are covered by a satisfactory environmental review. Again, this could be HUD's Part 50 review for covered soft costs, or a separate environmental review conducted by the responsible entity under Part 58, or both. For fiscal year 23 hard costs, any hard cost incurred prior to the federal nexus of December 29th, 2022. So again, for fiscal year 23, the federal nexus and the date of legislative enactment are the same. For fiscal year 22, they were not the same. But for fiscal year 23, any hard costs incurred prior to the federal nexus are not eligible for repayment, full stop. Any hard costs that were incurred after the federal nexus that were also incurred after the environmental review process was completed are eligible for payment, but again, only if they are covered by and included in that satisfactory environmental review for the project. Now, hard cost activities associated with new contracts and commitments entered into after the federal nexus, but prior to the environmental review completion, are considered choice limiting actions and are not eligible for repayment. Again, if you believe that your project took choice limiting actions, please reach out to your environmental officer for next steps. Now, for hard costs that were incurred after the nexus, but before the environmental review was completed, and are associated with a pre-nexus contractual obligation, so aka work under contract, those activities and costs would be eligible for repayment, but only if they are ultimately covered by and included in a satisfactory environmental review for the project. They are not considered choice limiting actions because they are associated with pre-nexus contractual obligations. And while HUD recommends that all work stop after the federal nexus as best practice, we cannot require stopping work on activities under contractual obligations that predate the project becoming federalized. Just remember that moving forward with these types of activities prior to the completion of the environmental review process may put the project at risk of not being able to be funded if a satisfactory environmental review cannot ultimately be completed. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, we have the process flow graphic for fiscal year 23. So under the fiscal year 23 process, you are now allowed to incur eligible soft costs from the date of enactment, which was December 29th, 2022. You are also allowed to start incurring eligible hard costs at your own risk after enactment if the commitments were in place prior to the federal nexus, and if those activities are ultimately covered by a satisfactory environmental review. Then, after the grant agreement has been executed for a project, you can start requesting payment for eligible soft costs. And then once the grant agreement and environmental review have been completed, you may undertake all project activities and start requesting payment of all remaining eligible project funds. Next slide, please. Okay, and finally, just one last reminder here that the cost eligibility and process flow graphics assume that all eligible costs are for activities covered by the project scope of a satisfactory environmental review. Now, again, there might be multiple environmental reviews that cover your project, right? Because we have HUD's Part 50 programmatic nationwide environmental review for CPF soft costs, right? So you might have some soft costs that are covered under that environmental review, HUD's environmental review, and then you may have other hard cost activities or other soft cost activities that are not covered by HUD's review in a separate environmental review conducted by your responsible entity. In most situations, if your project has soft costs and hard costs, both of them, you're likely to have both of these, to have your activities covered by both of these reviews. Another note here is costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. So again, costs are considered incurred. So when you're using any of these resources, right, and you see the term incurred, costs are considered incurred at the point the service is performed, not when the contract is signed or when the customer is billed. And then finally, please make use of HUD's Part 50 for CPF soft costs. This is a programmatic nationwide environmental review that HUD has completed. We've done one for fiscal year 22 and one for fiscal year 23, and it covers most soft costs, but not all. So please check out the environmental review record. Check out these slides for more information on which soft costs are covered by HUD's Part 50 and which will need to be covered by a separate environmental review by your responsible entity. And you can find links to these programmatic environmental review records here on these slides, as well as on the CPF landing pages. All right, now I will hand it over to Ben to discuss documenting the environmental review for CPF grants.
All right, thank you, Omri. So let's talk about how you go about documenting the environmental review. And I'd like to remind everyone that the CPF program is required to use HEROS. So the rest of this presentation will have a particular focus on how you would document your review using HEROS. Next slide, please. So when we talk about documenting the environmental review, we first need to take a step back and look at the overall environmental review process. Here on the chart, we have each step of the process listed out, but they all point to the environmental review record block, also known as the ERR. So the ERR, the environmental review record, is your project file for environmental reviews, and all steps of the environmental review process should be documented in the ERR. So let's look at these steps a little bit more and just look at what each of them entail. And as I list these out, think about all the different things that would coincide with each of these steps and how they would all fit into the environmental review record template. So first, we define the project. This is where you would be gathering all of your project information, such as the funding sources, points of contact, and responsible entity information. And then you would put together your project summary, which includes a detailed project description summarizing all proposed activities that is part of the overall project. Then we have determining a level of review. Once you have a clear picture of the types of activity that will be taking place, you can determine the appropriate level of review, such as whether it's exempt, categorically excluded, not subject to, categorically excluded, subject to, or an environmental assessment. The third step of the process is performing the environmental review, or as I like to call it, conducting your analysis. This includes documenting compliance with the other requirements at 58.6, the related laws and authorities under 58.5, and for projects that require an environmental assessment, determining the impact with the environmental assessment factors and performing an analysis of alternatives. The fourth step is finalizing the review. Once you've completed your analysis, made your determinations, environmental finding, you would complete your environmental review. For CEST or environmental assessments, your higher level reviews, this would include publishing your review for public comment, submitting the request for release of funds, and waiting for the authority to use grant funds from HUD. Then the fifth step is expending your project funds. So once you get that approval, that authority to use grant funds, or if you didn't need to submit a request for release of funds for HUD pending your level of review, once you have that final step, you can start spending project funds. However, it's important to keep in mind that even after the environmental review has been completed, you may still need to go back and confirm if any mitigation measures or conditions that were tied to the completion review, if they've been satisfied, or, which brings us to the next step, the post-review considerations. Sometimes at the point of during your project, you may need to reevaluate the completed review to see if there has been a change in project scope or the environmental conditions have been changed or impacted in any way during the project phase. Next slide. So once again, all phases of the environmental review must be documented in your ERR. In HEROS, as soon as you start a new environmental review, the system creates an electronic environmental review record template for you. The ERR is a public document, meaning that it must be made available for public review when requested. In addition to guiding you through each phase of the environmental review process, the ERR should also contain all supporting documentation that will help provide a clear picture of the proposed undertaking and support determinations for compliance and impact. This includes the detailed project description, maps, photographs, site plans, correspondence and consultations, related studies, public notices, written documentation of findings, and a request for release of funds and authority to use grant funds forms. All these things can be uploaded into HEROS. The electronic template in HEROS is the official ERR. However, the system allows you to print a paper-based version of the ERR that can be shared with others that do not have access to HEROS. Later on, we'll discuss how the HEROS ERR is made available for the public to review without needing access to the system. And just as a reminder, Omri hit on this earlier, but if your activities are soft costs and fall under HUD's Part 50 Nationwide Programmatic Review, you do not need to create an ERR in HEROS, but you still need the approval from your grant officer. Next slide. All right, so for this slide, we're going to focus on our higher level of reviews for a moment, particularly the categorically excluded subject to and environmental assessments. Some of the components that differentiate the CEST and EAs from the lower levels of review, other than the more in-depth analysis that is required, is also the need to issue a public notice. Known as your notice of intent to request release of funds, and for specifically environmental assessments, your finding of no significant impact in addition to the notice of intent to request release of funds. CEST and EAs also require the submission of the 701515 request for release of funds form to HUD, and then the receipt of the 701516 authority use grant funds form from HUD. These additional steps for finalizing the review are not required for exempt CENST or even CEST reviews that convert to exempt. Next slide. Okay, so now how do we document the lower levels of review? Looking specifically at your exempt or categorically excluded, not subject to levels of review. So again, if your activity is soft costs and is covered under the Nationwide Programmatic Review, then you don't need to complete an environmental review in HEROS. Just simply send your project description to your grant officer. If they confirm that the project is eligible under the Nationwide Review, then document this correspondence and keep a copy of the review with your project files. If the project involves any activities not covered by the Nationwide Review, then you will need to create an environmental review for the project in HEROS. You'll need to provide your CGD and environmental officer a copy of the Part 58 signature page showing that the review was completed. Next slide. So let's talk about a bit about who processes the request for release of funds specifically for CPF projects. All request for release of funds for CPF grants should be completed in HEROS and assigned to the local CPD field office. Please keep in mind this can only be performed by the responsible entity. Each CPD field office has a designated request for release of funds point of contact for CPF. So if you are a responsible entity that receives other entitlement funding sources, then this individual may be different from who you would typically assign a review to for, say, a CDBG or home funded project. A list of each designated contact is available. If you need a copy of this list, please submit an AAQ to the CPF question pool. You will need to reach out to the project's request release of funds point of contact, or RROF POC, for instructions prior to submitting the request release of funds. Once the request release of funds has been submitted, HUD initiates a 15-day objection period. If no objections are received, the CPD director will sign and issue the authority to use grant funds to the grantee. This process will take place in HEROS. There are specific request release of funds and authority use grant funds screens in HEROS. So the RE would need to complete the RROF screen and then assign the review to the RROF POC in the system. Then after the objection period, the CPD director will certify the AUGF screen in HEROS and assign the review back to the responsible entity. Next slide. Okay, so let's look a little more closely at the steps for documenting the higher levels of review. A lot of this we've already mentioned on the previous slide, but this just gives a little bit clearer picture of the steps. So step 1, complete the environmental review analysis and make environmental finding. Step 2, at this point, the responsible entity would sign the environmental review signature page. And then step 3, publish the public notice. So for CEST reviews, this would be just a notice of intent to request release of funds, which is a 7-day public comment period. For environmental assessments, this would be a combined finding of no significant impact and notice of intent to request release of funds. And this would be a 15-day public comment period. After publishing the appropriate notice, the responsible entity should wait out the appropriate comment period. All right, next step is the next business day after your public comment period comes to an end, you would then submit the request release of funds to the point of contact for CPF grants. And again, this would be done by the responsible entity in HEROS. HUD will then wait the appropriate objection period before issuing the authority use grant funds to the responsible entity, who will then issue this or share this with the grant recipient if the grant recipient is not the responsible entity. Once the authority use grant funds has been received, the CPF grantee will need to provide a copy to both this CGD grant officer and the environmental officer. So in HEROS, there is a specific authority use grant fund screen, and HUD will complete the screen in the system. They will not issue a separate paper-based authority use grant funds form to either responsible entity or the grant recipient. So some ways that you can document a copy of the authority use grant funds is if the responsible entity would take a screenshot of the completed authority use grant fund screen, or if you generate the final version of the environmental review record, on the first page of that downloaded Microsoft Word document, there will be a section for authority use grant funds 701516. And if the screen had been completed, then there would be a check mark next to it. So these are two ways you can provide a copy to your grant officer and environmental officer showing that the project's environmental review requirements have been met. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about when HUD is conducting a Part 50 environmental review. So this would happen if HUD completes the environmental review on behalf of the grantee. This would really only occur if the local responsible entity had declined the request to perform the environmental review on behalf of a CPF grantee that is not considered to be a responsible entity, which again is a unit of general local government. Anytime HUD conducts an environmental review, it would be under the Part 50 regulations, whereas when the responsible entity conducts an environmental review, it is under Part 58 regulations. For Part 50, the review would still be prepared in HEROS, and the grantee can still prepare the review themselves or hire a consultant to prepare the review, but it would have to be completed by HUD staff. So once analysis has been completed, the review would not require a request release of funds or an authority use grant funds. They would be considered complete after they have been signed and certified by HUD staff. So for exempt and CENST reviews, this would be considered complete after they are signed by the HUD environmental officer. For CEST and environmental assessment reviews, These must be certified by the CPD field office director as the approving official. HUD environmental officers will also provide a copy of the completed environmental review to the grant officer and to the CPF grantee upon completion. Next slide. So we've been jumping around here quite a bit, but let's take another step back and look at what needs to be documented during the analysis phase of the environmental review process. For CEST and environmental assessment reviews, you need to document compliance with the other requirements at 58.6, related laws and authorities at 58.5, and the environmental assessment factors, which would be only for environmental assessments only. All of this analysis must be documented in HEROS, which does have specific screens and tables for each law, authority, and factor. Next slide. So let's look at the related laws and authorities. Each link on this slide, which will be provided to you within the coming weeks of this presentation, each link will take you to the individual page for the related law or authority. There you will find additional information on the documentation required for each law and authority. Since we have limited time here today, we want to just cover a handful of the sections. So let's look at, next slide, please. So let's look at a few of these laws and authorities. And again, I'd like to mention that the HUD Exchange hosts a great resource through the Environmental Review Program page where all related laws and authorities have their own information page that include general guidance, helpful resources, trainings, and a list of appropriate documentation that would satisfy compliance with that law or authority, which is exactly what we are looking at here on the screen. So many of the laws and authorities require at least one of the following forms of documentation. For example, airport clear zones. A map showing that the project site is not within range of a military or FAA regulated civilian airport could be all that you would need to provide in your environmental review record to document compliance with airport clear zones. Another example for site contamination. You may need to provide a copy of a completed phase 1 environmental site assessment to show that the site has no recognized environmental concerns or has no hazards or toxic substances on the site. And again, this is just one item documentation. Every project's different, every site's different, but the list here shows at least one of 3 options for site contamination. Or for coastal barrier resources, you can upload a map from the Fish and Wildlife Service to show that the project is not within a CBRS unit. All right, next slide. So here are a few more laws and authorities. Usually for flood insurance and floodplain management, you are required to provide a FEMA flood insurance rate map or firm to show whether the site is located within a special flood hazard area. For endangered species, a determination of effect would need to be made if the determination is may affect, unlikely to adversely affect, or likely to adversely affect, you would need to provide all correspondence with either Fish and Wildlife or with other consulting parties as part of your documentation in the ERR. For historic preservation, you also need a letter of effect, usually from your state or tribal historic preservation officer. But it's also important to remember that the ERR must show that the Section 106 review was completed before approval is given to proceed with HUD-assisted projects. Sometimes the Section 106 completion sometimes completion of the Section 106 process may come with a list of mitigation measures that need to be followed through with during the project. Once again, a full list of these compliance documents are provided on the HUD Exchange, but also HEROS will guide you through what is needed. And now I'd like to turn it over to Harrison to talk about what might be needed as far as compliance documentation for environmental assessments.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. Next slide, please. So the environmental assessment analysis. For the environmental assessments that you are completing in HEROS, once you have the related laws and authorities completed, and you've made a determination for each section, you will move on to the environmental assessment analysis. This is an additional section of the review that is only completed for environmental assessments. If your project is a CEST, you will not have to complete this section. For the EA analysis, you must thoroughly investigate the impact of the project on the surrounding environment, community, and population, and the impacts of the surrounding conditions on the project. Within the analysis section, there are 5 different categories of factors that include climate and energy, land development, socioeconomic, community, facilities and services, and natural features. Within each category, there are several sections that will have to be completed. The analysis for each factor requires that you first make a determination using one of the 4 codes. Number 1 being minor beneficial impact, 2 being no impact anticipated, 3 being minor adverse impact, or 4 being significant or potentially significant impact. Once you select your determination from the drop-down menu, you will then provide a written explanation of how you chose the impact that each factor has to the project. In the event that there are any adverse impacts, you may also need to provide how the impact will be mitigated on the right-hand side. While there are quite a few factors to analyze for EAs, there are several really important resources available to you via the HUD Exchange. Each factor and each section that needs to be completed have guides that will walk you through the process and provide detailed instructions for how to make your determination. This is a screen that takes a lot of information, so depending on the project and scope of work, you may run into some small issues with HEROS. If you do encounter any issues, please submit an AAQ and HEROS staff will be able to assist you. In some cases, it may be better to upload EA factors as a document instead of copying and pasting them onto the screen. Another hot tip here is to be sure to avoid special characters, and most of all, I think my personal favorite tip is to save early and save often on this screen. Next slide, please. So completing the ER in HEROS. Once you've completed all the previous steps of the review, HEROS will take you through the completion process. The process differs slightly between CEST and environmental assessment reviews, kind of like with the EA analysis process. For CEST reviews, HEROS will take you to screen 6210 CES determination. Here you will select one of the 3 options that HEROS provides. The first option, CEST converts to exempt, is a CEST review that does not have any circumstances that require compliance with any of the related laws and authorities at 58.5. If your CEST converts to exempt, you do not need to complete a public notice process or submit the request for release of funds to HUD. Once signed, this review will be complete. The second option here, the project cannot convert to exempt, will be triggered when there are circumstances which require compliance with one or more federal laws or authorities. In this case, you will complete the compliance requirements, publish the request for release of funds notice, and submit that request for release of funds to HUD in order to obtain the authority to use grant funds. The final option for completing CEST reviews is that the review found that extraordinary circumstances exist within the project area that warrant the completion of an environmental assessment. This scenario is necessary when a project may result in significant environmental impact or is taking an action that would trigger the completion of an environmental assessment. If you have any questions about which determination is right for your project, we recommend that you contact your regional environmental officer for additional assistance. If your CEST review converts to exempt, you will have to complete the EA factors and analysis screen and go through the EA completion steps that we'll go over next. And finally, for the environmental assessment, after the completion of the EA factors and analysis, HEROS will take you to a screen where you're required to determine if the project has a finding of no significant impact or a finding of significant impact. If the project has a FONSI, you will proceed to the package screen and continue the EA process. If, however, a significant impact was found, an environmental impact statement would be needed. And again, can't stress this enough, if you find that your project results and the necessary completion of an environmental impact statement, please reach out to your grant officer as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So once you've completed your review, you'll need to do two things simultaneously. The first is inform the public of your findings and request release of funds. And then the second is to complete the review using the signature page in HEROS. Something to note here, the HUD Exchange does have sample legal notices that you can use for the process of public notice. Your public comment period will start the day that your review is signed. So once you have your review signed, you'll download and print that signature page, have it signed, re-upload the document. Once that's signed by your certifying officer, and once signed and uploaded, you'll need to also provide the closing date of the public comment period and provide details for where the public can direct their comments. Please note that the environmental review must be signed at least 7 days prior to, so that's for a CEST, or 15 days prior to, for an environmental assessment, the public comment closing date. Also important to note here, the public notice and commenting process still occurs outside of HEROS, and you are responsible for publishing or posting the notice separately. You may wish to provide a link to the HUD.gov website when publishing or posting your public notice or your request for release of funds. Once uploaded, the last step is you'll click the Generate and Post Review Record button at the bottom to finalize your review and post it for public comment on the HUD.gov webpage. Next screen, please. So, as I just mentioned, posting your environmental reviews to the HUD website. Your environmental review record will be posted on the website within 24 hours of completion for the duration of the public comment period. If you update or change the environmental review during the public comment period, you may press the Generate and Post Environmental Review Record button again in HEROS to post the updated version. And that'll be your last step for completing the environmental review in HEROS. Next slide, please. So mitigation, this is something that Ben touched on a little bit earlier. In some cases, you'll find that you cannot clear one of the related laws or authorities for your review. And in these instances, the environmental review may be completed with mitigation measures or conditions for approval in order for the project to be in compliance. Any mitigation measures or conditions for approval need to be included in the public notice to allow interested parties to provide informed comments. When an environmental review has mitigation conditions, they are often implemented after the review is complete and the project is underway. Some projects may choose to fix any issues that crop up during the review process, but mitigation allows you to move forward with the completion of the review while still answering to those issues that were identified. After the review is complete, any necessary documentation needed for mitigation has to be added to the environmental review record. While you may use a responsible entity in your area to complete the review, grantees are ultimately responsible for making sure that mitigation measures are completed and all requested documentation is provided to the responsible entity. Once complete, documentation of mitigation must be added to the environmental review record in HEROS. Next slide, please. So we've covered the basics of what mitigation is, broadly speaking, but how do we end up with mitigation in our environmental review? The screenshot included on this page comes from the HEROS Mitigation Measures and Conditions screen. As you can see, the screen automatically puts together a table for you that includes the law, authority, or factor, mitigation measure, or conditions to a project. There are 3 ways to add mitigation measures or conditions to your project. First, when you are going through the related laws and authorities in HEROS, for any law or authority that you can not document compliance, you will provide information on that screen about mitigation. The second is from the EA factor screen. When a factor is 3, minor adverse impact, or 4, significant or potentially significant impact, you can add mitigation in the 3rd column on the EA factors analysis screen. Any information that you put in the mitigation column will be added here to the mitigation screen. And the 3rd way to add mitigation measure or condition is to do so manually on this screen by clicking Add Mitigation Measure or Condition Factor. If mitigation is required, you should have a strategy for how the mitigation will be carried out during the project phase.
believe we lost audio at this time.
Great. We can go on to the next slide.
Okay.
Okay, apologies everyone, but switching gears here, we're looking at how tiering is, the process of tiered environmental reviews is documented in HEROS. So now that we've covered the environmental review record, documenting the environmental review using HEROS and the mitigation process, we also need to talk about tiering. For environmental reviews, tiering as defined in 40 CFR 1508.28 is a means of making the environmental review process more efficient by taking a broader approach to reviewing similar activities. The goal of tiering is to eliminate repeating parts of the review process over and over again. So when they could be covered instead by using tiering. So in essence, tiering may be appropriate when the responsible entity is evaluating a collection of projects that would fund the same or very similar activities repeatedly within a defined local geographic area and time frame. So for example, rehabilitating many single family homes within a city district or neighborhood over the course of 1 to 5 years, but where the specific sites and activities are not yet known. So that's the biggest thing with tiering. When you think about when would tiering be appropriate for our program, it would if you are doing the same program over a period of time and you do not know where the specific uh, project sites are located. If you do know where your specific project sites are, then you would want to look more into aggregation and not tiering. So a tiered review consists of 2 stages. The first is completion of a broad level review, and the second stage is the completion of subsequent site-specific reviews. Next slide. So when to tier and when not to tier? That is the question. Here we have a few scenarios of where tiering may be your best option and a few in which it may not be. The first option, if you are preparing to conduct a program of similar or repetitive activities, for example, your grant is for single family rehab or your project is for sidewalk repair. If specific sites have not been determined, then tiering may be appropriate for your project. Another option would be if the activities that you are planning to perform under your CPF grant are scattered but limited to a specific geographic area. For example, if you are planning to do projects in a specific area, such as neighborhood or defined portion of a city, in this case, tiering may be an appropriate option. Because of the complexity of tiering, we also recommend that you only choose to use tiering for a project if you're familiar with HUD's tiering policies and you have discussed your tiering strategy with HUD field staff. Now, how about when not to tier? Tiering is not appropriate for preparing to conduct unspecified activities using a single funding source. Remember, from our to tier list, we are tiering when we have a specific activity in mind. So in our example, you cannot use tiering when using CDBG funds to do any activities under that program. This would be too broad. A specific activity would need to be connected to the review. Another example of when not to tier is if the site for your project has already been identified. For example, if you are constructing a new housing development, in this case, the land would already be identified and would require a standard environmental review. We also strongly encourage you to consider not to tier if you are new to the environmental review process, and tiering sounds just like an easy way out of the environmental review process. While it does have its advantages, tiering is a fairly difficult process. Next slide. So this process, again, involves 2 stages of review. First, we have the broad level review. The broad level review must identify and evaluate any issues that can be fully addressed and resolved. And here by issues, we mean compliance with the related laws and authorities. The broad level review should evaluate each of the laws and authorities that require compliance to confirm whether or not they can be covered under the broad level review. For example, if you're doing a broad level review for that single family rehab project that we were discussing on the last slide, then you'd be able to evaluate coastal barrier resources if you know that there are no coastal barrier resource units in your area. For any areas where compliance cannot yet be determined under the broad level review, you need to define how compliance will be achieved at the site specific level. So then, what's the site specific review? The site specific review should cover all the sections that could not be determined for at the broad level review. Site-specific reviews must be completed for each individual site. So you would not be able to start your site-specific review until the location of that site has become known. And you cannot commit HUD funds to a specific site until that site-specific review has been completed as well. The site-specific review should not repeat any sections that were covered under the broad level review, and it must document the project's adherence to all established protocols and requirements that you defined in your broad level review. For example, for our broad level review, we were unable to document compliance with the site contamination section. The site-specific review must document compliance with site contamination and any other laws and authorities that were defined in the protocol. Next slide. A few more important things to note about tiered reviews. Since each review is contingent upon the other, a tiered review is not considered complete without both the broad level and site-specific review. When you're completing your site-specific reviews, you have to ensure that the corresponding broad level review is identified and that they are filed together. Here's a really important part to note. Broad level reviews are set up in HEROS under the tiered review section, but site-specific reviews have to be completed on paper and then uploaded into HEROS under the broad level review. And the reason for that is there's no standard format for site-specific reviews because the site-specific review is based on what was documented on the broad level review. And every program or project that you're using tiering for can be different based on functionality of the activity or the geographical range that the tiered review is being based on. And I'd also like to note that failure to maintain documentation of both a broad level and site-specific review for each project is a major cause of HUD noncompliance findings that often result in penalties and sanctions, including the repayment of funds. You can find additional, so this is just a big broad level review of the tiered process. There is a lot more guidance on the HUD Exchange, some helpful webinars that really can show you how tiered reviews are documented in HEROS. But if you ever think whether tiering would be useful for you, we again encourage you to first reach out to your regional environmental officer and talk about it with them first. Because like we said earlier, although tiering is a great way to streamline your environmental review process, it also comes with a lot of additional complexities. So be sure to be in touch with your HUD environmental officer, and they'll provide you as much guidance as you may need. Next slide. So that's all we have on today for cost eligibility, documenting a review, mitigation, and tiering. Again, here's a list of helpful resources that can guide you through your environmental review process. All of these documents can be found on either the FY22 or FY23 CPF homepages. And we've covered these materials in the past 2 webinars as well. But for those of you that are here for the first time, this slide contains a bunch of key guidance and resources for CPF and environmental reviews. Next slide. So we are running close to out of time here today, so I'm going to skip over this FAQ section. But we will have responses to each of these questions and to all of the questions that were submitted today during this webinar. We'll have responses to all of these questions available in the next coming weeks, along with the presentation materials from all 3 webinar sessions. Next slide. And if you have any immediate questions that you would like answered, please again submit a question through the AAQ desk. This desk is on HUD Exchange, and you could submit your question to the CPF Community Project Funding Program question pool. Next slide. So this is the end of the CPF Environmental Review webinar series. Please note that you will need to, there is a next CPF webinar on June 7th, which you would need to register for. This will be on Forms 101. And all presentation materials for the past 3 environmental review webinars will be posted shortly. We are still working through finalizing all of the materials. We hope to have the presentation materials for session 1 available on the HUD Exchange in the next, at least within the next week or so, followed shortly by the session 2 materials. When materials are made available, we will email all participants through the heroes.er@collaboratorsgroup.com email address, and then we'll also make sure that CPF listservs have the available information and the links of where all materials have been posted. So with that said, thank you all for joining today's session and for the previous 2 sessions as well.
Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar, and thank you for using Event Services. This webinar has ended and you may disconnect.